The Mongols have been linked to some of the most important developments in Asian and European history. Their actions helped bring about the Ottoman Empire, encouraged the spread of Islam across Asia, introduced gunpowder to Europe, and contributed to the creation of the Mughal Empire in India. They may even be connected to the meaning of the word kamikaze. To understand how so many seemingly separate events could be connected to one people, we need to begin with the rise and eventual expansion of the Mongol Empire. Chapter 1. Creating an Empire. The story begins in the region that is now Mongolia and Siberia. The Mongols were only one of many nomadic peoples living across this enormous stretch of land. Groups in the region were constantly fighting over territory and influence, but the Mongols themselves were not a single, united nation. They were divided into a number of clans, and each clan claimed descent from a famous warrior of the distant past. These clans competed with one another for control of land and for dominance over the wider Mongol population. One of those groups was known as the Kamag Mongols. In 1162, its leader had a son who would eventually become famous as Genghis Khan. His father, however, named him Temujin. The name was taken from a man his father had captured on the very day the boy was born. It was a public demonstration of strength. By naming his son after a defeated enemy, Temujin's father was showing everyone that he was powerful and suggesting that his son would grow into a powerful man as well. In Mongol political culture, this kind of prestige mattered enormously. Temujin was 9 years old when his father was murdered. He was far too young to take control of the clan, so another clan seized leadership of the Kamag Mongols. Temujin lost the authority and influence that should have come to him, and he swore that one day he would take revenge on those who had taken his family's position. Revenge, however, required soldiers. Over the years, he gradually gathered a personal following of Mongol warriors who were willing to fight under his command. This small force attracted the attention of a chief from another tribe. Impressed by Temujin and by the loyalty of the men around him, the chief arranged for his daughter to marry him. The marriage created an alliance between Temujin and the chief, giving Temujin additional support and helping him build the strength he needed. Together, they conquered the Orkhon Valley. The valley was valuable for several reasons. Its soil was fertile, it lay across important trade routes, and it held great religious significance. There was a widespread belief that the person who controlled the Orkhon Valley possessed the power to establish a mighty empire. Controlling it was therefore more than a military achievement. It was also a source of wealth, prestige, and legitimacy. By the time Temujin reached the age of 40, he had become powerful enough to turn against the clans that had taken his father's territory. In 1204, he defeated the Naiman and Murgid clans. Their warriors were absorbed into his own army. Their unmarried princesses were married into Temujin's family, and their former rulers were reduced to the status of his vassals. Defeated peoples were not simply driven away, they were incorporated into the growing system that Temujin controlled. Temujin also intended to govern in a way that differed sharply from the traditions of many other Mongol leaders. In other Mongol groups, family connections often determined who received authority. An unintelligent uncle might be appointed a general merely because he belonged to the right family, while a highly capable foot soldier could be denied any chance to rise. Temujin rejected that approach. He placed people in positions of power according to what they could actually do. Under his system, a man with no important family background could become a general if he proved himself to be an excellent commander. Success and ability mattered more than ancestry. This encouraged people to compete through their achievements rather than relying solely on their relatives. The result was a leadership structure filled with more capable administrators, more effective generals, and more competent officials. There was another advantage to this arrangement. If someone from an ordinary background rose to a position of influence under Temujin, that person understood exactly who had given them their opportunity. Their wealth and status came from Temujin's system, so they had a powerful reason to remain loyal to him. The structure combined ability with personal allegiance. It was both competent and dependable. Within only a few years, this approach made Temujin the most powerful Mongol leader in Mongolia. The other Mongol leaders realized that he was not simply another rival. They feared that, after defeating one group, he would eventually come for them as well. In 1206, the leaders of the Mongol clans gathered for a great meeting to decide how they should respond. Temujin had accumulated enormous prestige. He had demonstrated that he could command armies, organize an efficient government, and negotiate skillfully with potential allies. The assembled leaders concluded that resisting him might be impossible, while supporting him could give them a place within the new order. They therefore crowned him the Great Khan of all the Mongols. He became known as Chinggis Khan or Genghis Khan, and the position he received was broadly comparable to that of an emperor. In 1206, at the age of 44, Temujin created the Mongol Empire. Chapter 2: The Empire of Chinggis Khan. The new empire was built around two straightforward objectives. The first was to ensure that only Chinggis Khan's family could rule it. Temujin had established a system in which the most capable people could gain positions of authority, but he did not apply that principle equally to the question of succession. When it came to the throne, he wanted power to remain within his own family. The plan was to guarantee that only one of his sons could become the next great Khan after his death. If the succession were clearly restricted in this way, other powerful figures would have less reason to fight for the throne. No unrelated noble could simply launch a rebellion and claim that he should become the empire's next ruler. By limiting the succession to a single family line, Chinggis Khan hoped to make the empire more stable and prevent disputes from breaking it apart immediately after his death. The second objective was to make the Mongol frontier secure by conquering every neighboring people. The Turks and the Tatars were among the groups around them. The reasoning was blunt but practical. A neighboring state could not invade the Mongols first if the Mongols invaded and defeated it beforehand. Security would be achieved by removing potential enemies before they had the opportunity to become a threat. That strategy created a new difficulty. Conquering a population did not necessarily make it loyal. People who had been defeated but still retained their own leaders, customs, and identity could eventually rebel. Military victory alone could not guarantee permanent control. The Mongols therefore needed a way to transform conquered peoples, and the solution they adopted was assimilation. Assimilation meant forcing outsiders to abandon their existing culture, customs, and entire way of life, then replacing them with Mongol culture and Mongol traditions. To see how this could happen, we first need to understand what Mongol society looked like in practice. The Mongols lived in large, mobile communities known as hordes. A horde might contain only a few hundred people, or it might number in the tens of thousands. It was not merely a group of soldiers. Children, older people, fighters, craftspeople, and cattle all traveled together within it. A horde was designed to sustain itself, gathering or producing the food and materials its members required, without depending on a permanent town or outside authority. To find enough food and supplies, however, a horde had to keep moving. Siberia offered enormous spaces, but it did not provide an unlimited supply of food or useful materials in any one location. When an area no longer had enough plants to gather, grass for the cattle, or animals to hunt, the entire community packed up. People collected their belongings, moved their tents and herds, and migrated to another place where the resources were more plentiful. The Mongols used this social structure to assimilate members of other tribes and hordes. People from conquered communities were forced to join Mongol hordes rather than remaining together with their own people. Within each horde, every person had a designated place where their tent could be set up. That position depended on the person's prestige and standing within the community. Outsiders were deliberately placed among Mongols, with their tents surrounded by those of people from the conquering population. Their neighbors were therefore Mongols rather than members of their original tribe. They no longer had a nearby community with whom they could easily practice their old customs, speak in the same social setting, or preserve the habits of their former way of life. Instead, they were compelled to participate in Mongol society. Over time, this pressure became even more effective. Children born into those families grew up surrounded by Mongol neighbors and traditions. They would be raised within the horde and would gradually come to think of themselves as Mongols. In this way, the original culture of conquered tribes was slowly replaced by the culture of the empire. The groups that accepted this process were not simply punished or ignored. Cooperation brought rewards. Assimilated tribes could receive land, a share of the wealth captured in war, and positions within the Mongol government. Joining the Mongol system could therefore offer a defeated people a route to prosperity and influence, even though it required them to surrender much of their previous identity. At the same time, assimilation did not mean that the Mongols refused to learn from other societies. They also took useful elements from the cultures they conquered and incorporated them into their own civilization. The method of placing conquered people inside Mongol communities, for example, was not an invention of the Mongols themselves. They had learned that practice from the Turks. When the Mongols invaded China, they encountered technologies that could strengthen their armies. From the Chinese, they learned about catapults, hand grenades, and simple missiles. These were only a few examples among hundreds of smaller adaptations. Again and again, the Mongols adopted practical ideas from other peoples, adding them to their own military and cultural traditions rather than abandoning their distinct identity. Their willingness to absorb useful knowledge became especially important when they turned towards China. After subjugating the tribes that surrounded their homeland, the Mongols began attacking the Chinese states. China was not ruled by one unified government at this time. Several different countries controlled different parts of the region, and the state nearest to the Mongols was known as the Great Jin. The Great Jin appeared to possess nearly every advantage over the Mongols. Its population was larger, its technology was more advanced, and it maintained a substantial professional army. That army had experience defending the country against nomadic invaders, including peoples much like the Mongols. On paper, the Great Jin seemed far better prepared for war than the newly formed Mongol Empire. Genghis Khan therefore had to rely on intelligence rather than simply throwing his forces into battle. One of the most effective strategies the Mongols developed was to launch invasions during winter. Before the age of modern technology, armies generally could not campaign through the winter months. Snow covered the ground, roads disappeared, there was no reliable way to keep a large force supplied with food. The Mongols, however, had grown up in Siberia. They knew how to live through severe winters and had learned to find food even when the cold became extreme. That meant they could travel freely at a time when most other armies were forced to remain in place. They could move across the frozen landscape, strike at isolated armies or settlements, and withdraw at speed if a larger force came towards them. They did not need to defeat the Chinese armies head-on. If an enemy force managed to get close, the Mongol troops would mount their horses, ride away from the soldiers pursuing them, and fire arrows as they went. The Chinese had no equivalent force of mounted archers. Their cavalry and infantry could not answer the Mongols' attacks while being kept at a distance. In practice, they had only two choices: continue chasing the horde and be killed by its arrows, or stop and allow it to escape. The only realistic way to defeat the Mongols was to outmaneuver them by sending several armies against them at once. Even that almost never happened. Between the year 1211 and the year 1215, Genghis Khan conquered most of the northern provinces of the Great Jin. In the following year, the Mongols turned their attention towards Central Asia. Their first target there was an empire known as Kara Kitai, which they crushed. They also persuaded the Uyghurs to join the Mongol Empire without fighting. The Uyghurs later became important bureaucrats in the territories the Mongols occupied. The next major campaign began in the year 1218, when the Mongols attacked the Khwarezmian Empire. This state controlled parts of Central Asia and Iran. 3 years later, in the year 1221, it too had been conquered. The Mongols then turned against the Kimyk Khanate. The Kimyks were nomads, like the Mongols themselves, but they were less capable as a military power, and the Mongols defeated them by the year 1227. When the Mongols took new territory, they usually did not place Mongol rulers directly in charge. The Mongols lived in mobile hordes and had little interest in settling permanently in cities. Instead, they looked for capable people among the conquered population and appointed them as rulers and administrators. There was one important exception. If a kingdom surrendered without putting up a fight, its existing king was often allowed to remain in power. That ruler still had to pay taxes, provide soldiers, and accept Mongol administrators at his court. This arrangement created movement across an enormous area. Gunpowder specialists from China traveled into Central Asia, Middle East, and Eastern Europe. Uyghur officials became administrators in Iran, while Chinese peasants established farms in Mongolia. The rulers and administrators of all these different lands became part of an organization known as the Mongol bureaucracy. It administered the empire on behalf of the Great Khan, and the rulers of conquered territories were compelled to join it. The kings, officials, and other powerful figures within the Mongol Empire met regularly to discuss its future. Whenever someone wanted to take an important action, such as declaring a war or beginning a major construction project, permission had to be requested from the Mongol bureaucracy. In return for backing one another's plans, its members supported the decisions and projects of the other administrators. The result was a system in which the empire was governed through consent. A ruler needed the approval of the other members of the bureaucracy, while those same members also depended on receiving his approval. This created a network of mutual support. No individual administrator could simply act as though the rest of the empire had nothing to do with his decisions. Membership also brought considerable practical benefits. The Mongols were constantly beginning new wars. When they invaded a territory, they plundered it, and after conquering it, they demanded tribute. That wealth was sent back to Mongolia. The Mongols themselves were not interested in building up large private stores of possessions. As nomads who were frequently on the move, they could own only what they were able to carry with them. The plunder was therefore distributed throughout the empire. The Great Khan divided it among the tribes and kingdoms that remained loyal to him. Those judged to be more useful and more dependable received a larger share. The leaders of each tribe or kingdom then passed portions down to their own lords and clan chiefs. Those leaders distributed it again among their people, so that eventually every loyal subject received something from the spoils. By continually bringing in fresh plunder and tribute, the Mongol leadership could keep its subjects loyal. Loyalty was rewarded with wealth, and the promise of further wealth encouraged people to remain loyal. The system tied military success, political obedience, and the distribution of riches together. By the year 1227, the Mongol Empire stretched from the Caspian Sea in the west all the way to China in the east. That year brought a devastating double loss. Genghis Khan's eldest son died, and only a few weeks later, Genghis Khan himself also died. Both the ruler of the empire and the person who stood to inherit it were suddenly gone. The leaders of the Mongol Empire now had to travel to Mongolia and decide who would rule next. The choice had to be unanimous. It took 2 years before they finally selected Genghis Khan's third son, Ögedei. In the year 1229, he became Ögedei Khan. The empire had grown too large for one ruler to manage directly. Ögedei responded by dividing it into 3 regions. Each region was called a khanate because it was governed by a khan. These khans all came from Genghis Khan's family, and each khanate was ultimately subject to the authority of the Great Khan. The arrangement was rather like an empire with one emperor at the top and several kings governing separate regions beneath him. The first khanate was the Golden Horde, which occupied southern Russia. It had originally been assigned to Genghis Khan's eldest son, Jochi. Jochi had already died, however, so his sons ruled the horde in his place. Russia contained vast stretches of open grassland, making it an ideal environment for the Mongols and their way of life. The second was the Chagatai Khanate in Central Asia. It was given to Genghis Khan's second son, Chagatai, which is where its name came from. Because this Khanate stood at the center of the Mongol Empire, it became particularly important for administration, trade routes, and the collection of tribute. The third Khanate belonged to Ögedei himself. His territories included Mongolia, northern China, and Iran. While Ögedei was being chosen as Great Khan, however, the empire's enemies were preparing to fight back. The first years of his reign were therefore spent putting down rebellions and defeating foreign forces that had entered Mongol territory. Once those immediate threats had been dealt with, Ögedei resumed the expansion of the empire. He ordered the Golden Horde to invade Eastern Europe. Mongol troops in Iran were instructed to conquer the remaining parts of that region. The Chagatai Khanate was sent towards India, although that campaign failed. Ögedei himself concentrated on finishing the work begun by his father. In the year 1234, he finally destroyed the Great Jin. 5 years later, in the year 1239, he conquered northern Korea. He also began the invasion of another Chinese state, the Song dynasty. Ögedei's own conquests were not especially extensive compared with those of Genghis Khan, but he succeeded in eliminating all the countries that had managed to survive Genghis Khan's earlier invasions. After 12 years as ruler, Ögedei died in the year 1241. The Mongol leaders then faced another succession crisis. Their next election lasted 5 years, and eventually they chose Guyuk. He became Guyuk Khan in the year 1246. The empire Guyuk inherited was vast, so vast that governing it effectively was becoming increasingly difficult. The problem was not simply its size. Every part of the empire operated according to a different political system. The Mongols had not usually replaced those systems after conquering a territory. Instead, they had placed Mongol administrators at the top of the existing governments. That approach had allowed the Mongols to rule many different peoples without rebuilding every government from the ground up. It also left them trying to control a collection of states that all worked in different ways. Guyuk therefore ordered the bureaucracies of the Mongol vassals to be transformed so that they followed the same system used by the Mongols themselves. Guyuk introduced his own version of Mongol bureaucracy and then ordered a census across the entire empire. Officials were sent out in every direction to record exactly what the Mongols had conquered during the previous 35 years. He would not live long enough to see that enormous task completed. After only 2 years as Great Khan, he died in 1248. Once again, the Mongols began the process of choosing a new ruler. This time, however, the competing candidates did not merely argue or negotiate. They fought an actual war to decide who would become Great Khan. Modern elections may have their faults, but at least most election campaigns do not involve armies marching against one another. After 3 years of conflict, Mongke was selected, and he took the title of Mongke Khan in 1251. Mongke is generally regarded as the last truly successful Mongol emperor. He carried on Guyuk's reforms while also bringing the empire under more direct control from the center. He restricted the spending of Mongol princes, acted against corruption, introduced taxes on merchants, and prohibited the indiscriminate plundering of civilian populations. The aim was no longer simply to strip conquered communities of everything they possessed. The Mongols wanted to turn those populations into obedient vassals who could provide a continuing source of revenue. During Mongke's reign, Mongol armies captured eastern Syria, Baghdad, and parts of Turkey in the Middle East. In China, they conquered the kingdom of Dali. Korea and Vietnam were forced into the position of vassal states. In Europe, Mongol power extended across all of Russia. Their victories had become so extensive that the Mongols began to regard world conquest as their destiny. Their ambition could be expressed in a simple formula: one world, one ruler. Those conquests had an unexpected effect on trade. The great routes across Asia became safer than they had ever been. A merchant could purchase silk in Korea and travel overland all the way to Europe without being robbed at every stage of the journey. Mongol power had created a single zone in which traders could move with a level of security that had previously been almost impossible to imagine. Mongke died in 1259. At that point, the empire stretched from Korea in the east to Romania in the west. His death, however, triggered another struggle over succession. For 5 more years, the Mongols fought a civil war that was presented as an election. Eventually, in 1264, Kublai Khan emerged as the winner. Yet this victory did not restore the empire's unity. The other Mongol Khanates did not accept Kublai as their ruler, and there were several reasons for their resistance. Kublai had long been fascinated by Chinese civilization. In many ways, he felt more connected to China than to the nomadic Mongol world from which his family had come. He also decided that the central purpose of his reign would be to conquer the remaining independent parts of China. The other Khanates had very different priorities. The Golden Horde wanted to push further into Europe. The Ilkhanate was interested in expanding through the Middle East. The Chagatai rulers wanted to invade India. Kublai could not persuade all these branches of the Mongol world to follow the same strategy, and in 1266, the Mongol Empire divided into 4 separate powers. The Golden Horde controlled Eastern Europe, the Chagatai Khanate dominated Central Asia, the Ilkhanate ruled in Iran, and the Mongol Ulus held East Asia. Each of these 4 Mongol states would eventually experience a different kind of decline. We begin with the Mongol Ulus in East Asia. Chapter 4: The Yuan Dynasty. Once Kublai Khan had lost control of most of the wider Mongol Empire, he concentrated his attention on China. 4 years later, he gave his East Asian empire a new name. From that point onwards, the Mongol state in China would be known as the Yuan Dynasty, using a Chinese title for a Mongol imperial house. After claiming the throne of China, Kublai also launched campaigns against Korea, Myanmar, and Tibet. But the invasion that became most famous was the attempt to conquer Japan. Whenever the Mongols prepared to attack a country, they needed an explanation that could be presented to their own people. The target had to be described as insulting the Mongols, threatening them, or refusing to submit. One familiar method was to threaten another country first. The threatened country would naturally gather troops along its frontier to defend itself. The Mongols could then point to those troops and claim that they were facing an act of aggression. Since an army had supposedly been assembled against them, the Mongols could present their own invasion as self-defense. They used this logic across Europe and Asia. Kublai Khan's message to Japan offers a particularly clear example. In it, he argued that the Japanese lived far across the sea, at a distance of 10,000 li, and that although they had long been in contact with China, they had never sent the annual tribute expected of them. Earlier Chinese rulers, he claimed, had been generous. They welcomed Japanese visitors and left Japan alone when no visitors arrived. But now, under the authority of the wise emperor, every land beneath the sun and moon belonged to him. The letter then abandoned any pretense of politeness. Kublai called the Japanese foolish little barbarians and demanded to know whether they dared defy him simply by refusing to submit. The message was not an invitation to negotiate as equals. It was a demand for recognition, backed by the implied threat of invasion. The first Mongol assault on Japan came in 1274. The fleet was destroyed by a typhoon, forcing the attackers to withdraw. The Mongols tried again in 1281, but the second invasion was also wrecked by a typhoon. In Japan, these storms became known as a heavenly wind. The Japanese word for that idea was kamikaze. The failed invasions exposed a boundary that Mongol armies could not overcome. On land, their forces had defeated kingdoms across much of Eurasia. At sea, their power was far less reliable. Japan demonstrated that the Mongols' greatest enemy was not necessarily another army, but the ocean itself. This created a serious financial problem for the Yuan rulers. Mongol leaders had traditionally secured loyalty by distributing captured treasure and tribute among their followers. Until this point, every new conquest had brought in more wealth. But if further expansion was no longer possible, where would the next supply of tribute come from? Kublai's answer was reconstruction. Mongol invasions had destroyed a great deal of China's infrastructure. If the government rebuilt what had been damaged, it could make the country more productive and collect greater tribute from it. The plan included repairing and expanding the systems that supported agriculture, transport, and administration. Yet projects on that scale required power to be concentrated within a single organization. Consider the construction of a road. The ruler needs enough authority over local officials to prevent them from blocking the project, diverting its resources, or simply refusing to cooperate. The old Mongol political system, however, depended heavily on separate regions governing themselves. Authority was distributed among local rulers rather than gathered into one central administration. That arrangement had helped the Mongols manage their enormous empire, but it made large, coordinated building projects extremely difficult. So, if the Mongols wanted China to generate more revenue, they had to move away from the government they had inherited from the steppe. Kublai adopted the Chinese model instead. Under this system, the emperor and his court held the main authority, while officials throughout the country carried out central decisions. The new administration supervised the building of canals, roads, and rice fields. These were not merely grand monuments, they were practical investments intended to improve transport, increase food production, and ultimately provide the dynasty with more tribute. The transformation reached beyond China itself. Chinese people were sent north into Mongolia to create towns and cities. The purpose was to allow the Mongol heartland to obtain food directly from nearby Chinese communities instead of relying on supplies transported all the way from China. But once these settlements existed, even Mongolia required Chinese administrators to run them. Chinese bureaucrats became necessary not just in the conquered land, but in the homeland of the conquerors. That dependence gradually changed the Mongols themselves. The more the UN government relied on Chinese officials and Chinese institutions, the less distinctively Mongol it became. By 1307, the Chinese bureaucracy had effectively taken control of the Mongol bureaucracy. The conquerors had not simply placed themselves above Chinese civilization, they were increasingly absorbed into it. The Mongol population divided along two broad lines. Some Mongols moved into the cities and adapted to Chinese culture. Their descendants still live in China today. Others rejected that urban way of life and continued living within the horde, maintaining a more traditional Mongol existence beyond the cities. The Yuan state therefore contained a growing separation between Mongols who were becoming part of Chinese society and Mongols who remained attached to the steppe. The final weakening of the Yuan dynasty followed a series of natural disasters. During the 1350s, China suffered severe floods and plague. As conditions deteriorated, the population blamed the Mongol rulers. The reason was not simply that disasters had occurred under Mongol rule. The Mongol authorities continued to demand tribute, whether or not ordinary people had enough food left to pay it. People were forced to hand over their grain even when harvests had failed and supplies were already running out. They gave food to the Mongols and received little or nothing in return. Starvation spread, and eventually the suffering produced open rebellion. The Mongol army could defeat almost any organized force placed in front of it. What it could not defeat was the combined resistance of millions upon millions of civilians rising against the government. The rebellion grew stronger when local governors joined it. Rather than continuing to serve the UN court, they began establishing independent states of their own. The empire was no longer facing a single enemy that could be surrounded and destroyed. It was facing uprisings in one region after another, supported by officials who knew how the state worked and could use its resources against it. By 1368, the Mongol hordes recognized that the struggle could not be won. They gathered their possessions and withdrew northwards, returning to Mongolia. Once the Mongol army was no longer available to protect the emperor, the Yuan dynasty rapidly fell apart. Its territories broke into several separate countries, and Mongol rule in China came to an end. The Golden Horde began under the rule of Genghis Khan's eldest son. After his death, authority passed to Genghis Khan's grandsons. At first, it was a fairly modest khanate, but it possessed something the Mongols valued enormously: vast stretches of open grassland. This was ideal country for their people, their horses, and their way of life. In the years following Genghis Khan's death, the new rulers were occupied with putting down rebellions. Then, in 1237, they turned their attention towards Eastern Europe, especially the lands that now form much of Russia. The Russians seemed to have one overwhelming advantage. Their territory was enormous, and its winters were brutally cold. Any army attempting to cross such a country on foot might expect the climate to destroy it long before it could win a war. The Mongols, however, did not intend to cross Russia on foot. They traveled on horseback. The broad plains gave their forces room to maneuver, while also providing space for their tents and grazing animals. In only 4 years, Mongol armies had seized large parts of what is now Ukraine and Russia. From there, they looked towards the rest of Europe. 2 major routes led into the continent, one through Hungary and another through Poland. Several German states joined together in an attempt to create a defensive barrier against the Mongol advance. It failed almost entirely. In 1242, the Mongols killed roughly half of Hungary's population and conquered Bulgaria. In Poland, they won a battle so decisively that the German commander became terrified. He tried to conceal both himself and his soldiers from the Mongol army. Europe's defensive line had been shattered. The Mongols appeared ready to loot and conquer their way across the continent. Then, at the moment when victory seemed within reach, an unexpected message arrived. Guyuk Khan, the Great Khan, had died. A new Great Khan had to be chosen, and the election would take 3 years. In one of the most dramatic reversals in history, the Mongol armies withdrew just as they seemed poised to overrun Europe. The continent was spared, not because its armies had defeated the invaders, but because politics inside the Mongol Empire suddenly took priority. After that, the Golden Horde showed little enthusiasm for pushing into Western Europe. There were 2 principal reasons. The first was the landscape. Western Europe contained an abundance of rivers, mountains, and marshes. These features made it much harder for the Horde to move quickly, maintain its forces, and collect tribute from conquered lands. Compared with the open plains to the east, the region offered less value for the effort required to occupy it. The second problem was conflict within the Mongol world itself. In 1266, the wider Mongol Empire split into 4 separate khanates. Almost as soon as they became independent, those khanates began fighting one another. If the Golden Horde launched a serious invasion of Western Europe, the Ilkhanate or the Chagatai Khanate could take advantage of its absence and attack from another direction. A Western campaign was therefore extremely dangerous. The Mongols never advanced beyond the areas around Poland and Hungary. With further expansion largely blocked, the Golden Horde increasingly turned its attention inward. For a ruler within the horde, the greatest opportunities for power were no longer to be found in distant conquests. They lay inside the horde itself. Rival clans began competing for influence, and their disputes repeatedly developed into small civil wars. Those clans needed allies, and this was where the native Russian rulers became important. The Russians had been compelled to pay tribute to the Mongols, but they could use the rivalries within the horde to improve their own position. A Russian prince might support one clan against another in return for a lower tribute demand, additional territory, or permission for his children to marry into Mongol families. Russian rulers could also supply soldiers, weapons, food, and other necessities. As time passed, the Golden Horde depended more heavily on Russian assistance whenever one faction sought to defeat another. The Russian rulers who gained influence in this way were then able to strengthen their own lands. They constructed roads, founded new settlements, and brought more farmland under cultivation. Those improvements generated greater wealth, which made the same rulers still more powerful. Their growing strength, in turn, intensified the struggles taking place inside the Golden Horde. There was a structural weakness in the way the Mongols had originally organized their Eastern European possessions. After the conquest, the territory was divided between the various clans. The divisions had been designed to keep the clans balanced so that none could become powerful enough to dominate the others. But during the 13th and 14th centuries, that balance gradually disappeared. Some regions became prosperous, while others grew poorer. This mattered because a Mongol leader could not remain in power without distributing tribute among his followers. If the amount of tribute available to a clan declined, its leader could be challenged or removed. A poorer region was therefore not merely an economic disappointment, it was a threat to the authority of the person who governed it. The clans responded by fighting one another again and again, each trying to protect its share of wealth and preserve its position. By the 14th century, the civil wars had become so frequent and destructive that every descendant of Genghis Khan living within the Golden Horde was eventually killed. This created a political crisis of the most serious kind. Mongol tradition held that only a member of Genghis Khan's family could rule the Golden Horde. Now there was no such member left. With the royal line gone, almost anyone with sufficient military backing could claim the title of Great Khan. Every major clan began trying to place its own candidate on the throne. Rather than solving the problem, the absence of a legitimate descendant produced even more fighting. The throne became the prize in a permanent contest between rival factions, and the Horde's political structure continued to break apart. Some Mongols eventually questioned why they should remain in the Golden Horde at all. If life within it meant endlessly battling over who would control the government, leaving could seem more sensible than continuing the struggle. During the 15th century, some groups gathered their belongings and moved back towards Mongolia. Others stayed in place, but declared themselves independent of the Horde. While Mongol factions weakened their empire through internal warfare, Russian rulers were steadily increasing their wealth through cautious diplomacy. The balance of power slowly changed. The Golden Horde came to rely on Russian allies for troops and material support, while the Russian principalities increasingly coordinated their own actions. The Russians eventually united around Moscow and launched a rebellion against their Mongol overlords. In 1480, Russia became independent. Independence did not bring an end to conflict or difficulty. It brought problems of its own. For the next 303 years, Russian rulers tried to conquer the territories that had once belonged to the Golden Horde. The process took centuries, and the last of the Horde's khanates to be absorbed into Russia was the Crimean Khanate on the 8th of April, 1783. The Mongols connected with the Golden Horde followed different paths. Some returned to Mongolia, while others remained in the lands they had conquered and gradually integrated with the local populations. Their descendants are found among Russians, Ukrainians, Latvians, and many other ethnic groups. The Ilkhanate was established in 1256 by Mongol Khan after Mongol armies had conquered most of Iran, Baghdad, and parts of Anatolia. Its rulers attempted to continue westwards and bring the entire Middle East under their control. The conquest of Baghdad, however, encouraged the remaining Arab states to prepare their own defenses. The Mongols were at their most effective in open country, where their mounted troops could spread out, move rapidly, surround an opponent, and attack from unexpected directions. The Middle East contained plenty of open ground, which might initially have appeared ideal. Much of that open ground, though, was desert. Before the invention of motor vehicles, there were only a limited number of practical routes through such regions. An invading army could not simply travel wherever it wished. The Mongols were consequently forced into narrow corridors and predictable approaches. Instead of constantly outmaneuvering their enemies or appearing suddenly in places no one expected, they often had to fight in confined passages. There was another complication as well. Horses were frightened by camels, and the armies of the Middle East frequently used large numbers of them. The presence of camels could disrupt one of the Mongols' most important military advantages. These difficulties placed a ceiling on the Ilkhanate's expansion towards the west. It never reached the Mediterranean Sea. Instead, it found itself hemmed in by deserts on one side and by rival Mongol states on the others, including the Golden Horde and the Chagatai Khanate, as well as by Arab powers. War with its neighbors became a regular feature of Ilkhanate politics. That constant warfare exposed another weakness. The Ilkhanate could not maintain a large Mongol horde in the same way that the steppe-based Mongol states could. Its territory was extensive, but much of it was unsuitable for the lifestyle on which a Mongol army depended. A horde needed wide grasslands where its animals could graze. The Ilkhanate controlled large areas of mountains, desert, and sea. Horses could not feed on bare rock, sand, or salt water, so the army could not move freely throughout its own realm. At the same time, many of those difficult regions contained valuable cities. Baghdad, for instance, was a major urban center even though it stood in a desert beside a river. The city was economically and politically important, but the surrounding environment could not support the kind of mobile, livestock-based army that had made Mongol expansion possible. A Mongol horde could graze its animals in this region, but only if it returned there regularly. If the horde failed to visit those lands for too long, the people living there would begin to rebel. That left the Mongols with an unpleasant choice. They could remain in the fertile grasslands, where their horses and cattle would have enough to eat, but risk losing control through rebellion. Or they could travel towards the thinly populated fields near important cities, where they would be in a better position to collect tribute, but where the land could not support the whole horde. Some of their people would inevitably go hungry and die. There was no easy answer, so the horde had to keep moving. It needed to find enough food to survive, while also reaching the places from which it could obtain tribute. That constant movement made the Ilkhanate exceptionally difficult to unite and govern. A ruler cannot effectively control a region if his forces are unable to reach it at the moment they are needed. During a drought, the problem became even worse, because there was not enough food for anyone, whether Mongol or local. The Mongol clans would then turn against one another, fighting over land and the remaining resources simply because there was not enough to go around. This repeated conflict created serious instability. Merchants noticed that instability, and many began choosing routes through Russia rather than traveling through the Middle East. That change reduced the tribute reaching the Mongols. With less tribute available, the clans had even more reason to compete for land and resources, which produced still greater instability. One problem fed directly into the next, creating a cycle that the Ilkhanate struggled to break. A country can often survive one major crisis, particularly if its institutions are otherwise strong. But a state already under severe pressure is poorly equipped to endure another crisis immediately afterwards. In the Ilkhanate, all that was required was one especially damaging shock for the entire structure to begin collapsing. That shock came in 1316, when the Khan died. His son was still a child and was too young to take the throne. While the boy grew up, rival factions fought over who should control the state. Eventually, he reached adulthood and became the new Khan. Yet his reign did not last long. He died at the age of 31 in 1335. His large number of wives had produced only one child. To make the succession problem even more severe, that child was a girl. Women were not permitted to rule a Khanate, so there was no straightforward heir who could take power and prevent another struggle between competing factions. The situation was made still worse by the Black Death, which swept through the Ilkhanate during the 1330s. The disease killed many of the people who might otherwise have been possible candidates for the throne. A new ruler was eventually found, at least for a time, but he inherited several crises at once and could not keep the Ilkhanate united. He was captured during a battle, after which the Ilkhanate's territories were divided among several different countries. Mongol rule in the Middle East and Persia finally ended in 1335. The Chagatai Khanate had been established by Chagatai Khan in 1227, and it controlled most of Central Asia. Unlike the dry and difficult lands that challenged the Ilkhanate, Central Asia contained wide, open grasslands where Mongol horses and cattle could graze. This made it comparatively easy for the Mongols to live there. Over the centuries, however, they gradually adopted the local way of life and became more deeply integrated into the societies they ruled. There were three main reasons for this transformation. The first was political pressure from Kublai Khan. As part of his attempt to bring the wider Mongol Empire together under a government modeled on China, he forced the Mongols to change the way they lived and ruled. Nomadic independence did not fit easily with the more centralized, Chinese-style system he wanted to establish. The second reason was the arrival of guns. Firearms were practical for a soldier fighting on foot, but they were extremely awkward to use from horseback. Reloading a musket required both hands. A rider, meanwhile, needed to keep at least one hand available to control the horse from time to time. A mounted warrior could draw and fire a bow while riding, but could not spend more than a minute reloading a musket without losing control of the animal. As muskets developed a greater range than bows, the military advantage of the Mongol horsemen began to disappear. An opposing army could shoot at the Mongols from a distance and defeat them before the mounted warriors came close enough to answer with arrows. However formidable a warrior might be, strength and courage offered little protection against a bullet. The traditional Mongol style of warfare was becoming much less effective. The final major reason was simply the length of time the Mongols had spent in Central Asia. They lived there for almost 500 years. Across that enormous period, they learned to coexist with the people under their rule, rather than remaining a separate conquering population forever. As the wider world changed, the Mongols changed with it. They gradually abandoned nomadic life, settled in permanent communities, and became farmers and residents of cities. The end of the Chagatai Khanate was not marked by a long, dramatic collapse of the kind seen in the Ilkhanate. Eventually, it was conquered by another power, the Dzungar Khanate. The Dzungars had once been conquered by the Mongols themselves. 500 years later, they returned as conquerors and took their revenge by defeating the Chagatai Khanate. Then, in 1755, China conquered the Dzungars. This region has remained Chinese territory to the present day, bringing about a remarkably unceremonious end to an empire that had played such a large role in shaping the world. Even so, the Chagatai Khanate left behind an important legacy. After the destruction of the Ilkhanate, the Chagatai rulers moved into Iran and conquered most of it. In 1370, they created the Timurid Empire, named after Timur Khan. Timur's conquests across Iran and Central Asia represented the final major expansion of a Mongol empire. After that point, Mongol power began a slow decline. The Mongol legacy did not disappear entirely, however, and one of its surviving branches eventually conquered India. One member of the dynasty was exiled and traveled to India, where he founded the Mughal Empire in 1526.